Our scripture reading today comes from the Gospel according to Mark. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up and rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him." Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. And this is the word of the Lord.
All righty, you guys can be seated. Well, welcome to Hope. My name is Brooklyn. I'm part of the team here. It's great to be with you. This summer, I celebrated my 7th year anniversary of living in New York City, which is crazy to think. I know, thank you. 7 years is a long time. But it's hard to believe sometimes it's been that long. And this summer has really had me thinking a lot about those first few weeks or months in New York. So I actually didn't have an apartment lined up when I moved. So I was couch surfing with some people from the church that I was at for the first 6 to 8 weeks that I lived here. But the first apartment that I was in for 2 weeks while the family was out of town was this incredible apartment on the Upper East Side. And it was a first floor apartment, and it had a really cool little back patio off the main living room. And I just thought, wow, this is pretty cool. But my very first night, after I'd said goodbye to my family, I'd kind of met a ton of new people for the first time, I was getting ready to go to bed when I noticed something. That back patio door was open. My mind went straight to the "I'm about to be murdered" space, right? Nothing was going to convince me otherwise. So naturally, I did what any young, scared 22-year-old girl would do. I went to the kitchen, I found the biggest knife I could find, and I started going through this apartment, shaking, flipping on every light switch, waiting to face an intruder that I was sure was in the apartment. Spoiler alert, I survived. There was no murderer. Yeah. It turns out earlier that day, I hadn't shut the patio door all the way. So the wind just blew it open while I was away. No one was there. It was just an error of my own earlier behavior. Just my imagination running a little wild with thoughts of a murderer in a scary big city like New York. Isn't it funny how sometimes fear doesn't wait for our facts? Whether the threat is real or imagined, it can take over in an instant. Some of us actually like to be scared, I've learned. We'll pay money to go to haunted houses, watch horror movies on purpose with the lights out, or tell ghost stories around a campfire. And with fall coming, that feels pretty appropriate. Creepy pop-ups start happening, scary movie marathons, and the like. But there's definitely a difference between the kind of fear we choose for fun and the fear that we can't escape. The fear that kind of keeps us up at night. When it gnaws on us when we think about our future, or our finances, our relationships, or our health. So I want to ask, what are you afraid of? If you've ever felt fear rise up in you, you're in good company. Even the disciples, the people that were with Jesus for a long time, every day had moments where they were afraid. And in our story today, that fear is more than just a hypothetical fear. It's the matter of life and death, quite literally. Right in the middle of it, Jesus turns to them and asks a question that still speaks to us today. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? We're continuing today in our series called Good Question, where we've been exploring some of the many questions that Jesus asked throughout his public ministry, as recorded in the accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And these questions weren't always clarifying questions, but they were ones that cut to the chase. They exposed assumptions and invited his listeners to think a little bit differently. Today, we're actually looking at a passage where Jesus is asked a question and then responds to that question with another question. So earlier that day, Jesus was teaching by the lake. He's teaching to these crowds in a series of parables, which were these short little fictitious stories that were pointing to some deeper realities about the kingdom of God. And when his disciples were listening to him teach to the crowds, they had some questions about what was going on. And so he would turn to them, teach them a little bit, and then go back to teaching to the big crowds. And at the end of that day, after teaching to both the bigger group and to his smaller crew, Jesus says to them, "Let's go to the other side." So they get in a boat, and they sail out for the other side, and other boats follow as well. While on this boat, Jesus falls asleep, which seems pretty reasonable. He just spent all day working his ministry job, and he leaves the sailing to the disciples. Now, the disciples, remember, are professional boat people. They were professional fishermen who knew a thing or two about sailing a boat, and they knew a thing or two about the Sea of Galilee where they were. But while they're out there, a storm hits, and chaos begins to ensue. I'd imagine that out of nowhere, this cold gust tears through the lake. The sky got really dark, and the waves start to get bigger and bigger, each one higher and angrier than the last. I'd imagine they're standing there as spray is like getting in their face, and their ankles are eventually submerged in water as the water continues to come over the edges. They likely pulled ropes or bailed with whatever they could find, shouting orders to each other to try to keep themselves afloat. But it wasn't enough. Even the seasoned fishermen knew that this was bad. And right in the middle of the chaos, Mark gives us this detail in verse 38. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. So what do the disciples do next? They wake him up. Yes, so I'm imagining this is not a gentle, "Hey, buddy, like it's time to wake up." The boat is taking on water, and they're stressed. I'd imagine it's a full-blown panic as they wake him up and say, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" And while I've never been in a fishing boat that was taking on water in the middle of a sea, that's some personal nightmare fuel for me, I do know what it's like to be overwhelmed, wave after wave, wondering if I'm going to make it out to the other side. I remember a season as a college senior. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. And everyone else around me seemed to have it figured out. And that pressure of figuring out my post-grad plans was beginning to mount. The summer before my senior year, I'd actually spent time as an intern in DC, and it opened my eyes to this whole new way of life that I didn't know before. So when I got back to the cornfields of Indiana, all I could think about was how can I get back to a global city? But I had no idea how to get there, no clear path forward, and I was getting stressed. After a lot of late night searching, daydreaming, I found myself torn between a couple of opportunities, one in DC and one here in New York. And that's really when my own personal storm of anxiety started to spiral and hit. I was beginning to have panic attacks almost every week, just feeling so overwhelmed by the weight of my decision. And on top of that, the RA job that I really loved had become a major source of an identity crisis in my life. And time was running out. I was so afraid of making the wrong decision and wasting my future. I didn't know what to do, so I defaulted to what a lot of us do when fear takes over. I fought, I fled, and I froze. So for me, fight really looked like analyzing and reanalyzing and overanalyzing every detail so that I would have every little thing in order so that I could control it. Flight looked like running away and escaping into my favorite flight movie, Megamind, and that was really evident to my closest friends, so that anytime they saw that I was watching that movie that semester, they called me because they were concerned. And then there was, of course, freeze, when all of that didn't work and panic was so strong that I shut down completely and couldn't make any decision. And the more that I fought, fled, and froze, the more exhausted and anxious I became. And it's not just me. Fear shows up for all of us. For some, fight is about control, working harder, achieving more, buying more, or mastering every variable so that nothing can surprise us. Flight might look like escaping into distraction, endless scrolling, binging shows, numbing out with food or alcohol or drugs to avoid our discomfort and our fear. Different strategies, but ultimately the same goal, to be our own savior in our storms. Fear and anxiety are woven into the culture around us. Gen Z has even been called the anxious generation, but really it's all of us. We've been living through political division that feels deeper than ever. The shared trauma of a pandemic, global tensions that dominate our headlines, and a constant sense that the ground beneath us isn't as steady as we thought. Whether we fight, flee, or freeze, we're all just really trying to survive the storm. The disciples had their own version of this that night on the Sea of Galilee. Some fought, pulling ropes, bailing water, doing everything they could to keep everything afloat. I'm guessing some wanted to flee, turn the boat around, head back to shore as fast as possible. And some froze, gripped by fear, convinced that this storm would take them down. Eventually, every one of them hit the limit of what they could do. And that's when their fear comes spilling out in a single, desperate question. Teacher, don't you care if we drown? Some of us have wondered where God is in this mess. Others of us might have answered that question a long time ago, that God isn't real or doesn't care. These disciples weren't strangers to Jesus. Again, they'd been following him for quite a while. They'd seen him heal the sick, cast out demons, and teach with such authority. They'd left everything behind to be with him. The wind, the waves, the water rising didn't just test the wood and the sails of the boat, but it tested their theology. In this moment, their question revealed a gap in what they knew about Jesus and what they actually believed about him in the middle of the storm. I think fear has a way of narrowing our vision, doesn't it? It makes God seem smaller and the storm seem a lot bigger. I know for me, in that season of my own panic and anxiety, my prayers started to sound a lot like those disciples' question, don't you care? Don't you care if I choose the wrong thing? Don't you care that I'm anxious all the time? Don't you care that I feel stuck and trapped and unsure? And maybe you've had your own version of that question. Don't you care if my sickness gets worse? Don't you care that my marriage is falling apart? Don't you care that I can't pay my bills? Don't you care that I'm alone? Don't you care that I'm miserable at work? When fear becomes the lens through which we see God, our question starts to sound like theirs. Don't you care if I die? In these moments, God can seem unable, unaware, uninterested in our well-being, like he's asleep on the cushion, unwilling to do anything about it. This is where the disciples were, convinced that if Jesus cared, he would do something. But instead of doing something the way I'd imagine they thought he would, instead of grabbing a bucket, Jesus stands and speaks, but not to them, but to the storm itself. Mark uses the word rebuked, that Jesus rebuked the wind. That's very strong language. This isn't a gentle calm down. It's the same strong language Jesus used when he had actually confronted demons earlier in this chapter. Like the storm had no right to be there. And then, with the authority of someone who expects to be obeyed, he says, quiet, be still. I imagine the disciples frozen, holding their breath a little. And then silence. The wind dies, the waves flatten out entirely. And it's not just that the storm passes, it stops immediately. And nature doesn't do that. Even after storms pass, there are still ripples and swells, echoes of the chaos that once was. But when Jesus speaks, creation doesn't slowly comply, it obeys at once. Can you picture it? 1 minute, your world is roaring. The next, it's still enough that you can hear your own heartbeat. Now, for some of us, this moment might seem a little strange, even fantastical or kind of hard to believe. A man speaking to the weather and it listens? But here's what's important to know. Jesus had been teaching about the idea of the kingdom of heaven, the good and rightful rule of a God breaking into the world that's been fractured by sin and fear and chaos. And in this kingdom, nothing is outside of God's authority. Not sickness, not evil, not even the wind and the waves. Sometimes Jesus showed this through his teaching, like in the parables earlier in the chapter, changing the way that people saw God and each other. Other times, he showed it through miraculous signs, healing the sick, turning water into wine, or like here, demonstrating his authority over creation itself. The disciples may have felt out of control at that moment, but Jesus never was, because he's showing them that he is the promised king bringing wholeness into the world. Then he turns to his disciples and asks them, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Jesus doesn't ask this question to shame them, but he's revealing something to them. He's connecting the dots between faith and fear. Not to say that faith removes fear entirely, but that trusting in him somehow is going to change how we respond when fear arises. Notice that Jesus doesn't prevent the storm from coming. He has the authority to calm it and speak to it, but he also knew it was coming and let them sail into it. So why does he do that? I think it's because his presence in the storm is part of the lesson. That's the promise that he makes later in the Gospels. John writes, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. It's not promising an easy, smooth sailing ride all the time, but that even in the midst of a storm, Jesus has overcome. Dripping wet, the disciples look to one another and ask, "Who is this man?" I think what's interesting about Mark including that question is that the whole part before this answers the question of who this guy is, because now they know that Jesus isn't just a teacher and a healer, but this is actually their God in action. The same voice that said, "Let there be light," and there was light in Genesis 1. The same God who told the Red Sea to split apart in Exodus 14 so that his people could walk through it, and it did. And now that same voice is in their boat speaking to their storm. So what does faith look like in fear? When Jesus asks this question, he's not saying, if you had faith, you'd never be afraid. But notice that he does ask, why are you so afraid? He's not denying their fear. He's addressing the way that fear has actually taken over. So afraid implies an extreme fear that drowns out trust, a fear that controls the moment rather than faith shaping it. Fear is part of being human. He's inviting them and us to trust him even in the face of fear. And scripture is full of people who did just that. David cries out in fear in the caves. Elijah ran into the wilderness. The early church trembled under persecution. Fear itself was never the problem. The question was always, what would they do with it? And time again, God met them in their trembling, inviting them to bring their fear to him. And that's the invitation for us too. Faith doesn't mean pretending the storm isn't real or pasting a smile on our face and saying, "I'm fine." It means that when the waves rise and you feel powerless, that you reach for the one who holds authority even over the winds and the waves. Jesus doesn't just want to remove fear, but he wants to grow faith. And often that growth happens best in the places that we'd rather avoid. Think about it. When the sun is warm and the temperatures are right, you could probably go days without ever wondering if your boat's going to hold. But when the clouds roll in and the waves get higher, when you realize that maybe you're not as strong as you thought you were, that's when you really start paying attention to who's with you in the boat and how your boat is going to hold. Storms create the kind of pressure that reveals what we really trust in. They strip away the illusion of control and open the door for faith to take root in new ways. That's why Jesus' question is so piercing. Why are you so afraid? He knows fear exists, and he's inviting us to see when the fear has swelled so big that it drowns out our faith. And in that moment, we have a choice. Let fear run the show, or lean into the one who commands even creation. And here's the good news for anyone who feels their faith is small. Jesus didn't stand on the shore watching the boat go out, shouting instructions, waiting for the disciples to prove themselves. He was in the boat with them. He didn't prevent the storm, but he was present in it, living proof that trouble isn't the end of the story, because the one who overcomes it is with us. Storms will test the boat. They'll test your theology. They'll test your trust. So when fear starts steering, will you let it dictate your view of God, or will you let God's character redefine your fear? Because here's the hope we cling to. Faith doesn't erase it always, but it reorients us to the one who rules over our fear. It says, I may not control this storm, but I know the one who can speak to it. In Isaiah, he talks about Jesus as the Prince of Peace. And the disciples looked at the storm and saw chaos, and Jesus speaks to the storm, reveals more about his kingdom and his promise as the peace bringer. And that's still true today. His peace doesn't mean the waves always stop immediately, but it does mean that the storm doesn't get the final word. He does. Again, I've experienced that in a lot of different ways in my life. And one night during that particularly anxious season in my senior year, I felt a panic attack coming on, so I started walking to the parking lot to get to my car, because that was my safe spot. And as I was crossing the street through this parking lot, it was as if the whole parking lot had transformed into the streets of New York City. And as I sat into my car, I didn't have some polished prayer or any idea of what had just happened. But I desperately, blurty kind of way said, I think it's New York, isn't it? And in that moment, it was as if God himself had spoke to me, quiet, be still. And my panic lifted. I had still had questions about what came next, but I never once had a panic attack again about that decision. Now, I wish I could tell you that every single situation where anxiety is present results in immediate answers and peace like that, but it doesn't. I still face fears and anxiety in different seasons of my life. I still have moments where that creeps in and when life feels a little too heavy. But Jesus' presence is just as real. And that's the point, that our hope is not in a guaranteed outcome. It's in a God who is with us, whether the sea goes calm in a second or we ride out the waves for a while. Sometimes Jesus does quiet the storm in an instant. Other times, he steadies me in the storm. But his promise holds true. I am with you always. That's the kind of faith Jesus is inviting us into. Not a faith that never feels fear, but a faith that chooses to trust anyway. We live in a city that is wound tight with anxiety. You can feel it on the subway platforms or when people are crying in public with no judgment, in the rush of a crowded sidewalk, in the constant buzz of emails and citizen alerts. People are exhausted from trying to figure out how to save themselves in the middle of storms, working harder, hustling longer, numbing out, or just grasping for control. And into that world, Jesus sends us, not to match its panic or add to the noise, but to be a non-anxious presence in the midst of it. Not because we, again, never feel fear, but because the peace of Christ is with us. Sometimes that peace is what we carry into a room. And often we need others to help us remember it, which is why community matters so much. God didn't design us to face the storm alone. He gave us each other to help steady the boat when we can't see the shore. I've seen this in my own small group where we've had moments when someone was facing a scary health scare or uncertainty in their job situation or just a really crushing week. And the rest of us got to show up, praying for each other, sending encouragement throughout the week, bringing meals, and creating spaces to talk honestly about our fears without judgment. Those are the kinds of reminders that pull our eyes off the waves and back to Jesus. Being a non-anxious presence can look a lot of different ways. Slowing your pace to notice the people around you struggling, listening without rushing to fix, or praying for your coworker instead of joining in with the gossip. Offering practical help like groceries or a meal for someone in need, or speaking hope when people are spiraling. When we walk into our jobs and our classrooms, our homes, and our friend groups, we carry Jesus' presence in ways that hopefully people can see and feel. We become living reminders that there's a greater reality than the storm in front of them, that the one who commands the winds and the waves is still in control. And even if the people around you never open a Bible or come to church with you, they can still read your life. They can see what it looks like when fear doesn't get the last word because faith has taken its place. So today, as we reflect on this passage, I want to close by giving us space to not just hear the story and hear my thoughts on the story, but to see it and step into it and invite God to speak to you personally.